In the soft glow of an evening in St. Mary Mead, she begins a gentle investigation tracing the whispers, courage, and unity that reshaped the modern world. Welcome to the series of Drift Tales. I am your host, Ilyas. If you are interested in this kind of historical tales, please like this video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 1. The Box of Quiet Whispers. The evening in St. Mary Mead had settled into its usual softness, the kind of gentle quiet that drifts across the village like a warm shawl. Miss Marple sat near her window, a cup of lightly steamed lemon water resting beside her. Outside, the rose bush stirred faintly in the mild breeze, and the last strands of daylight glowed like fading golden threads. It was an ordinary evening, or so it appeared. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that mysteries often begin in silence, not noise. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. The postman stood there holding a small, time-worn wooden box, its brass edges dull with age. "Delivered from London, ma'am." "Sent from a Mr. Penfield," he said. Mr. Penfield, her late nephew's colleague, a historian of sorts. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly as she carried the box inside. It felt strangely heavy, not in weight alone, but in presence, as though it held stories unwilling to remain forgotten. When she lifted the lid, a faint scent of old paper rose like the breath of history itself. Inside were scattered notebooks, fragile letters, and maps with ink faded into sepia brown. On the top, written in a neat, firm hand, were 6 words: "Independence movements, clues left unseen." Miss Marple felt a familiar spark of curiosity. This was no mere historical archive. This was an investigation waiting to be understood. She unfolded the first letter, its edges brittle, the writing elegant and steady. At the top was written, "India, 1947, The Quiet Strength." Miss Marple began reading slowly, the way she approached all mysterious documents, with patience, respect, and a mind open to subtlety. The writer described not the battles or speeches that filled newspapers, but the quiet people behind India's struggle for freedom. He wrote of women spinning cloth in courtyards, creating a symbol stronger than any flag, of school teachers who whispered courage into children's hearts, of young men who walked miles delivering pamphlets that were small in size but enormous in purpose. What fascinated Miss Marple was the letter's repeated insistence that the real power of the movement came from people whose names would never appear in history books. At the bottom of the letter was a short phrase underlined twice: "Look for the movement beneath the movement." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. "That is often true in villages as well," she murmured gently. "The greatest changes begin where no one is looking." This letter, she realized, was not merely an account, it was a clue pointing toward a deeper mystery behind independence struggles across continents. Beneath the letters lay a folded map, surprisingly large and carefully preserved. When Miss Marple opened it across her table, she felt as though the map exhaled an entire century of events. Asia and Africa sprawled before her, marked with small symbols, circles, stars, faint pencil strokes that abruptly stopped, as though the writer had run out of time or breath. Near each symbol was a cryptic note: India, non-violence can shake an empire. Ghana, a teacher can change a nation. Egypt, crowds move, but ideas move deeper. Kenya, resistance grows in the soil long before it grows in the streets. Indonesia, whispers can be louder than cannons. Miss Marple traced each region with her fingertip. She felt as if she were following small trails that connected into one great path, a path of awakening, of transformation, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. At the bottom corner of the map was a sentence written hurriedly, almost breathlessly. When people awaken, empires tremble. She read the words twice, letting their weight sink into her thoughts. They were simple, yet profound, the kind of truth that comes not from theory but from lived experience. And then she noticed something else. Another line, much fainter, written as if the writer hesitated before finishing. Whoever understands human hearts can solve this. Miss Marple smiled softly. "Ah," she whispered, "so that is why the box found its way to me." Next, she discovered a small velvet folder. Its title was handwritten, "Why the Empires Began to Falter." Inside were short, precise observations, not the sort a formal historian would write, but those of a quiet observer, someone who saw through surfaces into human behavior. Empires do not collapse in explosions. They crumble in silence. Economic burdens become too heavy to hide behind pride. Wars drain more than armies. They drain certainty. When ordinary people begin to imagine freedom, they cannot unimagine it. Miss Marple read each line slowly, as if tasting its meaning. This was not political commentary. This was psychological insight, the kind she understood deeply. The final note in the folder caught her attention most. Freedom is planted first in the corners of the mind. Yes, Miss Marple whispered, like truth in a murder case. It begins quietly, grows steadily, and eventually reveals itself. These notes were more than reflections. They were another layer of clues in a vast and delicate mystery, a mystery not of crime but of courage. By now night had fully embraced St. Mary Mead. The moonlight drifted across the room, laying soft silver patches on the scattered papers. The wooden box, with all its centuries of breath, sat open like a witness ready to speak. Miss Marple placed her notebook on the table and wrote a single line. Investigation begins. What truly awakens nations? She felt no urgency, only the gentle excitement that comes when one stands at the beginning of a long, meaningful inquiry. Sleep story calm wrapped the room. Though her mind began to map connections, she wondered who had compiled these materials. Why had they chosen hints instead of explanations? Why did the trails stop abruptly, leaving gaps as though inviting her to fill them? Most of all, she understood that the box was not random. Someone believed Miss Marple, the quiet observer of small human truths, could uncover the deeper story behind independence movements. She closed the lid softly, not to hide the documents, but to honor them. "Very well," she whispered with a gentle nod. "Tomorrow we begin with India, the first quiet thread in this tapestry of freedom." And with that thought, she prepared for rest, letting the weight of history settle around her like a soft blanket. A new investigation had begun, one unlike any she had ever faced, stretching not across a village, but across nations. Chapter 2. India's Quiet Uprising. The next morning, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. A faint golden light filtered through her curtains, soft and warm, as though encouraging her to continue the investigation she had begun the night before. She made a simple breakfast, placed her teacup beside the wooden box, and opened her notebook with calm determination. She did not need to travel to India physically. The letters, journals, and maps would take her across continents through thought and insight. For Miss Marple, the human heart was more revealing than any passport stamp. At the top of the first folder for India was a brief note, written in hurried strokes. The power that grows without violence is the hardest to stop. Miss Marple adjusted her glasses. That, she murmured, is a principle I've observed even in the smallest of quarrels. True strength often looks like gentleness. She unfolded another sheet, a diary entry dated early 1940s, written by a British civil servant who had witnessed India's growing unrest. Yet the entry was not filled with fear or resentment, rather with bewilderment. How can one oppose people who refuse to raise their hands in anger? How does an empire negotiate with silence, with spinning wheels, with steadfast feet that march without weapons? Miss Marple read the lines with quiet fascination. She sensed that India's independence was not just a political struggle, it was a psychological riddle. And she, who had solved many riddles of the heart, leaned a little closer to the pages, ready to understand. A small packet of photographs slipped from between the pages. Miss Marple picked them up carefully. They showed simple scenes. Women spinning thread in courtyards. Children learning to read under banyan trees. Farmers pausing work to listen to a village speaker. Long lines of men walking with quiet discipline along dusty roads. Each photograph had a small handwritten caption. Resistance through rhythm of life, teaching freedom before claiming it. Quiet feet shaking loud power. Miss Marple studied the image of the spinning wheel, the charka. She had read about it before, but never from this intimate angle. The caption beneath it said, "When people make their own cloth, they unmake their chains." Miss Marple let that sentence sit inside her mind. A spinning wheel seemed such a harmless object, yet here it had become a symbol stronger than rifles. It reminded her of how in St. Mary Mead, small gestures often had deeper meanings. She recalled a conversation once from the village. A woman had stopped buying goods from a merchant who mistreated his workers. Within weeks, half the village followed. No confrontation, no shouting, but the merchant changed his ways. "Ah," Miss Marple whispered, "yes, I understand." Power begins to tremble when people refuse to participate in their own oppression. The independence movement in India had created a silent army, not of soldiers, but of ordinary people, quietly shifting the balance of power. This, she believed, was the movement beneath the movement mentioned in the earlier letter. Next, Miss Marple found a long, tightly folded document labeled "The Salt March, the Day the Ordinary Became Extraordinary." She unfolded it slowly. The paper crackled softly, as though reliving the footsteps that once shaped its story. The document described the famous march in simple, heartfelt language, not as a political event, but as a human moment. People walked for miles along the coastline, not with anger, but with a calm clarity that baffled the colonial authorities. The writer described how older men walked with straight backs despite aching limbs. Women carried water for strangers they had never met. Villagers stepped out of their homes silently to join the procession. And children used chalk to mark the path for others to follow. There was a special line Miss Marple reread twice. Empires are not defeated by shouting, but by thousands of feet marching in the same direction. The Salt March was not merely a protest, it was a signal, a declaration that people had stopped fearing the law and had begun fearing the loss of dignity instead. She felt a chill, not of coldness, but of realization. Here she saw what the folder last night had hinted at. Freedom begins in the corners of the mind. This march was a visible form of an invisible transformation. Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, India's power came not from force but from unity of purpose. Their strategy was not confrontation but awakening. She began to sense a pattern, a common thread that might appear again when she later studied Africa. At the bottom of the India folder were transcripts of conversations, not formal interviews, but small exchanges overheard by the document collector. One was between a young man and an elderly shopkeeper. "You'll be arrested if you march," the shopkeeper warned. "I know," the young man replied softly, "but I no longer fear prison. I fear remaining silent." Another conversation came from a train station, a mother telling her daughter, "If I don't return soon, tell your father I walked for your future." And another from a small school, a teacher telling students, "Learn history well, so you may walk into your own history someday." Miss Marple paused at that. She realized these moments were clues, tiny windows into the emotional landscape of a movement. People had reached a point where fear no longer controlled them. When fear collapses, oppressive power loses its foundation. This, she understood, was why the empire felt itself slowly unraveling. These were the quiet corners of the mind spreading across a nation. As Miss Marple closed the India folder, the afternoon sunlight softened to gentle amber around her table. She no longer felt like she was reading about history. She felt as though she had walked through it, step by quiet step, alongside those ordinary people. She wrote her first major conclusion. Independence movements succeed not by overpowering rulers, but by empowering people to see themselves differently. The more she reflected, the more she sensed that India was only the first thread in a much larger tapestry. She glanced at the map where Ghana, Egypt, Kenya, and Indonesia waited like unopened chapters of a serialized mystery. Miss Marple closed her notebook calmly. Tomorrow she would explore Africa, the next continent where the quiet hearts of ordinary people had reshaped history in ways no empire had expected. But tonight she allowed her mind to rest gently on India's lessons. Unity without violence, strength without weapons, courage without hatred. As evening settled once again over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt certain she was beginning to understand the deeper mystery behind freedom itself. Chapter 3: The Winds of Africa's Awakening. The next morning arrived with a hush of pale light over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple felt a quiet anticipation as she settled. At her table, the Africa folder laid neatly before her. India had taught her that freedom often begins not in clashes or declarations, but deep within the quiet corners of the heart. Now she wondered, what had awakened those corners in Africa? What invisible threads had pulled together millions across vast deserts, forests, and cities? She opened the folder slowly, as though stepping into a dream where history spoke not loudly, but in gentle breaths. At the top was a note written by the same observer from the Indian folder. Africa's awakening was not a single sound, but many whispers rising into one wind. Miss Marple touched the page thoughtfully. She had always believed that the truth of any mystery lies not in the noise, but in the patterns beneath it. And here, too, she sensed a pattern, waiting, patient but powerful. As she leafed through the pages, she felt as though she were traveling across dunes warmed by the sun, along river banks where old stories still lingered, through villages where elders passed on histories with a quiet authority that books could never contain. This chapter of her investigation had begun. Default Tay the first significant bundle of pages in the folder was dedicated to Ghana, one of the earliest African nations to achieve independence. Miss Marple unfolded a letter headed with the date 1952. It described a young teacher who had begun speaking to students about dignity, unity, and the possibility of a future free from colonial constraints. But the letter was not about speeches or political rallies. It focused on moments so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone but a careful observer, someone like Miss Marple. One passage read, he told his students, "If you learn who you are, no one can convince you that you are less." And slowly, the students carried that message home to their parents, and the parents spoke to their neighbors, and the whisper grew. Miss Marple smiled softly. "Yes," she murmured, "education is often the first flame of freedom." The writer of the letter described how the teacher, whose name was never mentioned, had simply moved from village to village, teaching, listening, encouraging. He was never recorded as a major historical figure, yet his influence spread through thousands of unremarkable conversations. Another note read, "Empires grow uneasy when the quiet begin to think loudly." Miss Marple wrote this line into her notebook. She could feel the same pulse she had sensed in India, the steady awakening of ordinary people realizing their own worth. In Ghana, the whisper of awakening had begun in classrooms, carried by children who understood their future before adults dared to imagine it. The next section of the folder was labeled, "Kenya, the Roots Beneath the Dust." Miss Marple found a bundle of field notes, written by a traveler who had visited Kenya during the early 1950s. The notes described not rebellion, but the meaning behind the rebellion, the years of tension that stretched far before any uprising was visible. One entry said, "Oppression here is not merely a political force. It is woven into the soil. When the land is taken, people lose more than livelihood, they lose memory." Another page described a gathering of elders beneath an acacia tree. There was no shouting, no calls for war, only long pauses and eyes that carried storms inside them. "We fight because our grandfathers cannot speak now," an elder reportedly said. "If we do not free the land, we cannot free ourselves." Miss Marple paused her reading. Here the movement was not only about independence, but about identity, about returning dignity to the ground from which generations had drawn their lives. And yet the traveler's most striking note was this: the rebellion began long before the first rifle was fired. It began the day silence became unbearable. Miss Marple leaned back, absorbing the depth of that statement. She had seen something similar in St. Mary Mead. People endure many things quietly, but the day their inner truth outweighs their fear, they can no longer remain still. That, she realized, was the emotional heartbeat of Kenya's movement. The fourth collection of documents centered on Egypt, particularly the movement that swept through Cairo and Alexandria during the early 20th century. Unlike India's silent marshes and Ghana's educational flame, Egypt's awakening had a different tone, a rising wave of public demand. Yet even here, the witness had focused not on the noise, but on the subtle undercurrents. One letter described watching crowds flow through Cairo's streets. The people moved not as individuals, but as one synchronized heartbeat. Their words were simple, bred, dignity, self-rule, yet their unity held the weight of centuries. Miss Marple studied the accompanying photograph, a sea of people in traditional garments, eyes lifted with determination rather than anger. The caption read, "When people believe their voice matters, fear dissolves into purpose." Another document described women participating in demonstrations, insisting on a future where their presence would not be pushed into shadows. Their bravery, the writer noted, was not loud, it was steady. Miss Marple found this line particularly striking. Egypt did not awaken through force. It awakened through recognition, the sudden realization that ordinary people shared the same dream. This thought resonated deeply with her. She had always believed that a village becomes strongest when its people understand each other's hopes. Here again she saw the pattern. India's unity of purpose, Ghana's awakening of dignity, Kenya's reclaiming of identity, Egypt's collective courage. Freedom was not a single story. It was a tapestry woven from countless threads of human realization. As Miss Marple finished reading the Africa documents, the evening sun melted into a soft peach glow outside her window. She felt both humbled and energized. These stories were not merely historical moments. They were clues, windows into the psychology of liberation. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Independence emerges when people begin to see themselves not as subjects, but as humans with rightful place and purpose." Below it, she added, "The triggers vary: identity, dignity, unity, education, yet the awakening feels the same in every land." She reflected on India's quiet discipline, Ghana's classrooms of courage, Kenya's buried memories rising as resolve, and Egypt's tide of collective will. Different landscapes, different histories, but the same transformation. People remembering who they were. Miss Marple gently closed the folder. Her investigation was expanding. Africa had not simply followed India. It had awakened through its own rhythms, its own stories, its own quiet storms. On the map, the next circle waited, Indonesia. But before she moved on, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of peaceful contemplation. She had begun by studying political history, yet what she found was human history, carried by whispers, courage, and the gentle insistence of ordinary people refusing to remain small. She whispered softly to herself, "Freedom, like truth, always begins quietly, and grows when someone finally listens." Chapter 4. Indonesia and the Echoes of Quiet Defiance. The next morning arrived with an especially gentle light, as though the sky itself had turned a soft page for Miss Marple's next chapter of investigation. The documents on Indonesia lay waiting on her table, bound together with a thin ribbon. Unlike the Africa or India files, this bundle felt lighter, not in importance, but in the type of story it held. Miss Marple loosened the ribbon with the same care she showed all mysteries, large or small. The top sheet held a simple line. Indonesia's freedom was a story of whispers, whispers that outlasted cannons. She let the words rest in her mind. A whisper, in her experience, could often be far more dangerous to injustice than an explosion. Explosions fade, but whispers spread. She took a sip of warm tea and turned the first page. Immediately she sensed that Indonesia's tale would be different, not defined by a single movement, but by a layered struggle shaped by oceans, spices, islands, traditions, and people who refused to let their identity dissolve into history's margins. She leaned forward. This was going to be a quiet, intricate mystery, the sort she understood best. The documents began with a traveler's account describing Indonesia not as a single nation, but as a constellation of islands, each with its own character, rhythm, and memory. To understand Indonesia's road to freedom, the writer noted, you must understand that it is not one voice speaking, but thousands. Yet somehow in their yearning they found one rhythm. Miss Marple found that poetic. She imagined fishermen rising before dawn, women gathering at markets, elders chanting old stories near evening fires. She pictured the spice routes that had drawn empires across half the world to these islands, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and cinnamon, each holding a value far beyond their small size. But the writer added something more perceptive. When wealth comes from the land, but dignity is taken from the people, a storm brews beneath even the quietest seas. Miss Marple looked out her own window for a moment. Even calm water, she reflected, can hide great tides beneath it. The notes described how foreign powers had long used Indonesia's resources to build distant kingdoms. Yet, inside the villages, families continued telling their children ancient epics, stories of resilience, unity, and identity. It struck Miss Marple that while rulers tried to claim the land, they could not claim the stories. And stories, she knew, were seeds of resistance. Miss Marple turned to the next set of pages titled, The Silent Architects of Freedom. These were descriptions of ordinary Indonesians whose names never appeared in celebratory speeches or printed histories. Their work happened in shadows, kitchens, schoolrooms, and small gatherings late at night. One note described seamstresses who hid secret messages inside folded cloth. Another told of boatmen who carried news between islands under the cover of fish baskets. Teachers rewrote lessons to include tales of their ancestors' strength, planting pride quietly into young hearts. A particularly moving entry said, They were not rebels. They were reminders to each other of who they were before outsiders drew borders around their islands. Miss Marple nodded. She recognized that kind of resistance. She had seen how oppressed people often revive identity before they reclaim territory. But the most fascinating part of the notes was a network of informal storytellers. Men who performed shadow puppet plays, slipping coded messages through ancient myths. Women who sang lullabies with new lines added, carrying warnings or news. Traveling merchants who sprinkled political hints into casual conversations. The writer commented, The Dutch Empire could censor newspapers, but it could not censor the ocean breeze that carried stories from village to village. Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, When knowledge moves through culture, it cannot be stopped by law. For her, this was the heart of Indonesia's independence movement, a resistance that grew not through armies, but through meaning. The next document was dated August 1945, the year Indonesia declared independence. It was written by a young clerk who had witnessed those pivotal days, but instead of grand speeches, he described quiet moments. Before the declaration was read aloud, people already knew, not because anyone told them, but because something inside them had shifted. Miss Marple read the lines several times. This, she realized, was the same inner transformation she had seen in India and Africa, the moment when subjugation becomes psychologically impossible. The clerk also wrote about something extraordinary. Groups of neighbors began gathering before dawn, silent but together. Farmers walked to their fields humming the same tune. Children carried small homemade flags, as though their hands could not stay empty any longer. It was not celebration, not yet. It was recognition. The declaration that followed was powerful, of course. The words echoed across the islands like a bell rung through history. But Miss Marple understood what the documents emphasized. Independence begins not on the day it is declared, but on the day people decide they are no longer willing to be anything but free. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the truth of it. In every case she had studied, India, Ghana, Kenya, Egypt, and now Indonesia, the outer events were merely reflections of an inner awakening. As Miss Marple reached the end of the Indonesia file, the afternoon sunlight had grown warm and golden, gently touching the edges of her papers. She felt a deep sense of calm, as though she had walked through Indonesia's villages herself, listening to the quiet courage floating in the air. She opened her notebook and began writing her reflections. In Indonesia, freedom grew through culture, stories, songs, and shared memory. Their resistance was woven through ordinary life, making it impossible to uproot. She underlined a final observation. When people reclaim who they are, no empire can decide for them what they will become. Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded in her lap. The investigation was no longer simply about historical events. It had become a study of human nature, a subject she understood better than most. She reached for the map again, tracing the line from India to Africa, then across the sea to Indonesia. Each region had awakened differently, yet they reflected the same truth. The world changes when people remember themselves. Miss Marple closed her notebook gently. Next, she would explore how global events, especially the world wars, had weakened the old empires and strengthened the courage of colonized nations. But for now, she allowed the calm of evening to settle around her. The whisper of Indonesia's stories lingered in her thoughts, soft as the wind that moves quietly yet reshapes entire oceans. Chapter 5. The Wars That Shook the Old World. 2 days after finishing the Indonesia documents, Miss Marple found herself re-sorting the papers inside the wooden box. She had sensed a pattern in India, Africa, and Indonesia, but there was still a missing link, something unspoken, yet present throughout every folder. That missing link seemed to be the global conflicts of the 20th century. At the very bottom of the box, she discovered a thin envelope marked simply, "World Wars, the Silent Accelerators." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written by a British soldier during World War II, but instead of detailing battles or commands, it held a startlingly thoughtful reflection. "We fight this war for freedom," they say. Yet I wonder what it must feel like for those under colonial rule, hearing such words. The soldier went on. "How strange that we insist freedom is sacred, yet deny it to others across the seas. One day, I think, this contradiction will return to face us." Miss Marple leaned back, absorbing the quiet honesty of an ordinary man, recognizing the paradox of his time. This was her first clue. The empires had preached freedom so loudly abroad that their own subjects began asking why they could not have it at home. She wrote in her notebook, "Wars expose contradictions that people can no longer ignore." The investigation into independence movements had now shifted from local voices to global tremors. The folder contained economic reports, personal notes, and newspaper clippings from the 1920s and 1940s. Miss Marple was not an economist, but she understood people, and behind every number she saw human strain. One report stated bluntly, "War consumes the strength of empires faster than colonized nations can rebel." Another document explained how the First World War had drained treasuries across Europe. Factories that once profited from colonies now struggled to pay wages. Whole economies depended on loans. Ships lay destroyed. Railways were damaged. Miss Marple read slowly, imagining the stress that had settled across capitals like London, Paris, and Amsterdam. The writer of the notes added, "The colonies, once seen as sources of wealth, soon became burdens when war expenses exploded beyond control." Miss Marple highlighted this in her mind. It echoed something she had seen in rural village families. When the breadwinner becomes overwhelmed, the entire household must rethink its structure. Similarly, Europe's exhaustion forced the world's great powers to loosen their grip. She understood then that independence movements had not pushed alone. The world wars had pulled the empires downward. The ground beneath colonial power had grown soft. The next bundle of pages contained personal accounts from soldiers from India, Africa, and Southeast Asia who had served in the world wars. Miss Marple found this section especially revealing. One page carried the testimony of a Ghanaian soldier. "We fought beside Europeans. We slept in the same tents. We ate the same food. But when the war ended, they wished us to return to being less than them. We could not." Another document quoted an Indian soldier who had served in the North African campaign. "We were told we were defending liberty. Whose liberty?" We began to ask questions. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. She could almost hear the tone, steady, disappointed, awakening. Serving abroad had given colonized soldiers a glimpse of another world, one where racial hierarchies were shaken and where human equality felt possible. When they returned home, they brought back not just uniforms and medals, but sharpened awareness. They had seen the cracks in empire from the inside. One final testimony stood out. "War taught us that Europeans are not invincible. They bleed, fear, and fail like all men. If they could not defend their own lands without us, then surely we could defend ours from them," Miss Marple wrote. War removed the illusion of superiority that colonialism depended on. The emotional shift was clear. Before the wars, people feared empire. After the wars, empire looked human and vulnerable. The last set of documents came from statesmen, journalists, and diplomats who had witnessed the global debate after World War II. Miss Marple read through transcripts of the newly formed United Nations and was surprised to see how often the word freedom appeared. A diplomat from Asia argued, "If the war was about ending tyranny, then colonial rule cannot continue." An African representative said, "We fought against fascism. We will not accept a softer form of it in our own lands." Newspapers from Europe reflected public fatigue with war and the desire to rebuild nations at home rather than police territories abroad. One article stated, "Britain must now choose between rebuilding itself or managing an empire. Doing both is impossible." Miss Marple saw the truth immediately, a truth she had often observed in village families. When new priorities emerge, old habits must be released. The war had shifted global values. Suddenly the idea of domination looked outdated. The world had begun speaking the language of self-determination. She wrote another note. "When the world accepts a new moral standard, even the strongest powers must eventually align." This was the final piece of the puzzle. Independence movements had grown stronger not only because people awakened, but because the world had changed its conscience. As the evening sun dimmed into peach and lavender shades, Miss Marple pushed her chair back and looked at her notes spread across the table. India, Africa, Indonesia, and now the global wars formed a pattern so elegant that she felt almost humbled. Each movement had grown from within, but each had also been pushed forward by winds far beyond its borders. She wrote her grand conclusion: no nation becomes free by struggle alone. Freedom is a layered mystery shaped by inner awakening, outer conditions, and the collapsing structures of power. She underlined it gently. In her mind, the mystery of independence was becoming clearer. First layer: people believe they deserve dignity. Second layer: empires weaken under strain. Third layer: global morality shift toward justice. When these three layers align, history inevitably turns. Miss Marple closed the folder with a deep, peaceful breath. She glanced at the remaining documents in the wooden box. The next chapter would involve understanding the emotional and cultural unity that allowed nations to rise together, invisible threads connecting Asia and Africa. But for now, she let her eyes rest, allowing the quiet of the evening to fold around her. The world wars had not just shaken nations. They had shaken assumptions, and in their wake, freedom had found space to breathe. Chapter 6: The Threads That Wove Nations Together. The morning light entered Miss Marple's sitting room softly, painting quiet shapes across her table. She reached for the next folder in the wooden box, this one labeled Unity Movements, the Bridges of Asia and Africa. This intrigued her deeply. She had already studied how people awakened within their own lands, how cultural pride revived, how wars weakened the old structures. But now she sensed she was about to explore something different, something connective. She opened the folder and found a map unlike the others. This map did not show borders, colonies, empires, or battles. Instead, it displayed arrows, letters, and tiny notes linking nations across vast oceans. India pointing toward Egypt. Ghana connected to Indonesia. Kenya linked to Burma. Japan influencing Vietnam. Egypt encouraging Sudan. Miss Marple felt a warm realization spread through her. This was not a map of land, she whispered, but a map of ideas. The independence movements had not grown in isolation. They had learned from one another, inspired one another, and strengthened one another. She leaned forward. This was the next layer of the mystery. The first set of documents contained letters exchanged between thinkers, activists, scholars, and students from different colonized nations. These were not grand political statements, but gentle, thoughtful reflections, written with humility, curiosity, and trust. One letter from an Indian student to a young Egyptian intellectual read, "Your struggle is our mirror. When you rise, we feel the world shift a little beneath our feet." Another, from a Burmese teacher to a Ghanaian leader, said, "We are far away in miles, but close in the hope we carry." Miss Marple smiled softly. She knew how letters could shape destinies. A kind letter could mend an old disagreement. A wise one could save a troubled soul. Here, letters were shaping entire futures. The notes described how shipworkers carried messages across the Indian Ocean, how university students traveling abroad brought home new ideas, and how writers published essays that crossed borders even when they were censored locally. There was a particularly striking line written by an anonymous observer. Empires controlled ports and checkpoints, but they could not control the journeys of ideas. Miss Marple wrote this carefully into her notebook. She had always believed that ideas, once awakened, behaved much like truth. They slipped through cracks, traveled invisibly, and reached places no guard could stop. These letters were the quiet threads stitching the world together. Next, Miss Marple found several thick pages titled, Bandung 1955, When Unity Took Form. She had heard the name Bandung Conference before, vaguely, but she had never known its emotional depth. The notes described a gathering in Indonesia where leaders from Asia and Africa met, not to divide land, but to share dreams. The descriptions were surprisingly gentle. Leaders walking through gardens, speaking calmly. Delegates exchanging stories of their nation's suffering. Moments of quiet understanding passing between strangers. One account read, Though they came from different continents, they recognized the same wound, and that recognition felt like healing. Another described the atmosphere. It was not a meeting of governments, it was a meeting of souls who had carried centuries of silence. Miss Marple paused to absorb this. She imagined tired yet determined leaders sitting side by side, realizing they were not alone. She imagined how comforting it must have felt to discover that another nation far away carried the same fears and the same hopes. A final statement in the document stayed with her. Bandung was not the beginning of unity, but the moment unity became visible. Miss Marple underlined the phrase. She understood that even in her small village, unity often existed long before people recognized it. The same was true among nations. The next part of the folder surprised her. It wasn't about leaders or big events. It was about ordinary people creating unity in ways they likely never realized. A journal entry described sailors who worked on ships traveling between Africa and Asia. They shared songs, recipes, and stories during long nights on the ocean. Their friendships crossed languages and backgrounds, and yet these tiny exchanges helped people see themselves as part of a larger world. Another account told of African and Asian laborers working together in British factories after the war. Their shared experiences of hardship helped bridge cultural divides. Then there were the traveling merchants who carried textiles from India into East Africa, introducing not only goods, but stories, and the teachers who brought books from Egypt into Sudan, sparking conversations that linked communities. Miss Marple found this line particularly moving. Unity does not begin in conferences, but in shared humanity. She wrote it down, she believed it wholeheartedly. Just as in St. Mary Mead, the most meaningful bonds were formed in quiet moments, neighbors helping neighbors, people sharing challenges. That she realized was also happening on a global scale. These unnoticed bridges were changing the emotional map of the world. As Miss Marple closed the folder, she felt a profound clarity settling around her thoughts. Unity, gentle, invisible, humble, was one of the strongest forces behind the global wave of independence. She took out her notebook and wrote her conclusions. No nation rises alone. Movements strengthen each other. A whisper in one land becomes wind in another. She then added, Unity of purpose creates a collective courage greater than any empire's fear. Looking at the wooden box, she realized that this investigation had become a journey across continents, but also a journey across the human spirit. She saw how struggles had echoed from India to Africa, from Indonesia to the Middle East, from Burma to Ghana. It was not a chain of rebellions. It was a chorus. Different cultures, races, religions, and histories, yet similar hopes. The unity movements had turned individual battles into a global awakening. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of this realization settle gently. She felt humbled imagining millions of people, scattered across far lands, unconsciously supporting each other through shared dreams. Her next task, she knew, would be to understand the emotional core of these movements. Why ordinary people, who once endured quietly, suddenly found themselves ready to stand up. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peaceful reflection. Across the pages, across oceans, across time, humanity had whispered the same word. Freedom. Chapter 7. The Hearts of Ordinary People. Late in the afternoon, as the sun gently slanted across the lace curtains, Miss Marple settled once more at her table. She reached for a folder she had not yet opened, one labeled in simple handwriting. Ordinary People, Extraordinary Courage. The name itself stirred something inside her. She had learned in her many years of solving mysteries that human nature was rarely defined by the powerful. Rather, it was shaped by those who lived quietly, who endured quietly, and who one day decided quiet was no longer enough. When she opened the folder, she expected personal notes. What she found instead made her pause. It was a collection of small, unremarkable objects. A faded train ticket from India, a scrap of cloth dyed in Ghanaian patterns, a pressed flower from a Kenyan mountainside, a torn page from a student's notebook in Burma, a small seashell from an Indonesian shore. None of them were valuable in money, yet each carried stories of ordinary people who had shaped history without ever intending to. Miss Marple leaned closer. This chapter, she felt, was the most important of all. The first document in the stack was titled, Women, the Silent Foundation of Resistance. It contained observations from villages, towns, and cities across colonial Asia and Africa. A letter from an Indian village described how women spun khadi cloth every evening, turning their humble spinning wheels into symbols of complete defiance. A Ghanaian note said, When men feared speaking out, women kept the hope alive in their songs. Their voices softened fear. In Egypt, a teacher wrote that women smuggled political leaflets beneath loaves of bread, knowing that soldiers rarely searched the baskets of market sellers. Miss Marple felt a deep respect rise within her. She had always known that women, in their patience and quiet endurance, often held societies together. They might appear gentle, but inside them rested a firmness that dictators and kings repeatedly underestimated. One sentence in a diary stood out. Women did not shout, they sustained. And because of them, courage did not run out. Miss Marple whispered the line aloud, as though honoring the millions who had lived it. She knew from her own village how much power was contained in seemingly ordinary acts. A woman comforting a child, refusing to accept unfairness, or quietly guiding a household through difficulty. Here, those same acts had blossomed into a force that helped reshape nations. The next section contained accounts of young people students, apprentices, young farmers, boys and girls whose awakening had provided momentum no empire could suppress. A Burmese student had written, We memorized our lessons, yes, but we dreamed of a day when we would write our own. A Kenyan farm boy recalled how he and his friends scratched symbols of freedom into the dirt when their elders were too afraid to speak openly. A young Egyptian messenger described how he carried letters through narrow alleys, pretending they were simple shopping lists. Miss Marple read these lines with a softened heart. She had always believed that youth carried within them an instinct for justice, a willingness to believe in what seemed impossible to older generations. Another note described a moment outside a school in Ghana. The children lined up to raise a flag they had drawn themselves. It was small, uneven, and the colors were fading. But as it rose, their faces lifted with it. Miss Marple paused, picturing that scene. Sometimes, she reflected, the future begins not with a decree, but with a child's drawing. Young people had imagined independence before many adults dared to. Their belief created an energy that rippled outward through homes, markets, fields, and cities. It was the beginning of a new emotional climate, one where hope became contagious. The fourth section shifted tone. These documents focused on the elders, those who remembered how life had been before colonial rule. Their memories, often gentle and quietly spoken, had shaped the emotional foundation of resistance. In Kenya, an elder had told the gathering, "They took our land, but they cannot take our stories. If we keep telling them, our children will remember who they are." Miss Marple felt a tremor of recognition. This was exactly what she had sensed from Indonesia's shadow puppet storytellers and from Africa's teachers. Another document recorded a conversation with an elderly Indonesian fisherman. "Empires speak loudly, but our ancestors speak in the way the waves return, again and again. That is enough." In India, a grandmother told her grandchildren, "One day you will walk freely. I may not see it, but I plant the seed in your thoughts." Miss Marple reflected on that. Human communities always stood on the foundation laid by those who came before. Elders held wisdom, memory, and warning all essential ingredients in creating a sense of historical identity. One line in the folder summarized it beautifully. The young gave movements energy. The elders gave them direction. Miss Marple wrote this down with care. When Miss Marple closed the folder, she felt something gentle and profound settle into her heart. She had studied independence movements through politics, through wars, through leaders and global forces, but now she understood the emotional truth behind it all. She reached for her notebook and wrote. Freedom was not won by extraordinary people. It was won when ordinary people decided they were extraordinary. She underlined it, then added, "Women spun courage. Youth imagined new worlds. Elders preserved memory. Together they awakened nations." As she wrote, a soft evening breeze entered the room. The wooden box felt lighter now, not because its contents had diminished, but because Miss Marple had begun to understand their true meaning. Every object, every letter, every note pointed to the same quiet revelation. History does not move because of grand gestures. It moves when ordinary hearts change their rhythm. Miss Marple felt a small but warm smile form on her face. She knew the next chapter in her investigation would focus on the psychology of fear and courage, how people who had accepted silence for years suddenly found themselves able to speak, march, or resist. But for tonight she allowed herself to rest with the comforting truth she had uncovered. The greatness of nations had been carried by the hands of ordinary men, women, and children. And that, she thought, was the most beautiful mystery of all. Chapter 8. When Fear Breaks and Courage Rises. The morning was unusually still when Miss Marple returned to her table, a fresh pot of tea beside her. The next folder in the wooden box was slimmer than the others, yet the title written on it carried a weight far greater than its size. Fear and Courage, the Turning of the Tide. Miss Marple touched the cover gently. She knew from her long life that fear was not simply an emotion. It was a condition that shaped entire societies. And courage, in contrast, was not noise or drum. It was a quiet shift inside the heart that changed everything. She opened the folder. The first page bore a single, thoughtful line. Fear breaks when people finally recognize that silence harms more than speaking. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had witnessed this truth in St. Mary Mead many times, people remaining silent until the moment came when truth demanded a voice. As she turned the page, she realized she was about to understand one of the deepest mysteries behind independence movements. What makes a people stop fearing something they have feared for generations? This, she felt, was the psychological hinge upon which history had turned. The first document described the emotional climate of India in the early 20th century. It was not a political report, but an intimate account of changing hearts. A witness wrote, "For years, people whispered their complaints. But then came a time when the whispering stopped, not because fear disappeared, but because dignity grew louder." Miss Marple read on. The account described a village where a small group of men had gathered to protest unfair taxes. They were not leaders, soldiers, or rebels, just farmers. For generations their families had bowed before authority. But on one ordinary afternoon, something changed. One farmer stood up and said, "If we do not speak today, our children will learn silence from us." Miss Marple paused at that. She understood the power of example, the heavy responsibility adults carried in shaping the next generation. The line reminded her of countless moments in small communities, where courage came not from anger, but from protectiveness. The account went on. Fear did not vanish in a moment. It dissolved slowly, each time someone realized they were not alone. This was the key. Courage in India had not erupted suddenly. It had risen gently, like dawn light creeping across the fields. Miss Marple wrote, "Fear weakens when people witness each other's strength." It was a simple human truth, yet it had shaken an empire. The next section of the folder was devoted to Africa, but it did not describe battles or speeches. Instead, it revealed the interior emotional currents that had prepared entire nations for resistance. One page contained an observation from a Kenyan elder. "The colonizers thought we were quiet because we agreed. We were quiet because we remembered." Miss Marple felt a gentle shiver. Memory was its own form of power, a reminder that people had once lived freely, proudly, and fully. That memory made acceptance of oppression fragile. Another testimony from Ghana described a meeting of villagers who had gathered under a tree. No one wanted to speak first, but when one voice rose, the others followed like leaves turning toward the same sun. The writer went on to explain that fear did not disappear. Instead, it became small enough to sit beside courage instead of blocking it entirely. Miss Marple knew this pattern. She had seen it in the village when townspeople finally confronted wrongdoing. The true shift was not a shout, but a collective inhalation, a shared awareness that this moment is different. A final line from the document read, "The day fear was named out loud, it lost its throne." Miss Marple wrote this into her notebook. Fear, she knew, often relied on silence. Once spoken, it became manageable, almost ordinary, and therefore no longer overpowering. Africa's movements had risen when fear became a word, not a master. Next, Miss Marple found Indonesian accounts that illuminated another dimension of courage, the certainty that the oppressor's power was not infinite. One observer wrote, "People feared the Dutch for generations, but when the Japanese defeated them, the illusion of invincibility shattered." This realization spread like light through a curtain. If one power could fall, another could too. That was all it took for courage to grow. Miss Marple understood immediately. Sometimes courage is not born from bravery, but from recognition that the powerful are human, that authority is not absolute, and that the world can change in a moment. Another Indonesian account described how villagers, once terrified of speaking, began to whisper forbidden ideas during evening gatherings. Soon, those whispers became conversations. Conversations became plans, and plans became movements. One villager wrote, "We did not wake up fearless. We woke knowing fear had become too heavy to carry." Miss Marple admired the quiet honesty of that line. Fear had not vanished, it had been outweighed. As Miss Marple finished reading, the sunlight had softened into a warm amber glow. She closed the folder slowly, her mind filled with reflections. She reached for her notebook and wrote the most important insight so far. Fear is strong when it isolates people. Courage is stronger when people realize their fear is shared. She continued, "Courage does not replace fear. It rises beside it, tall enough to carry the day." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. This chapter revealed that independence movements had not relied on extraordinary figures or dramatic acts. They had depended on subtle emotional shifts, farmers deciding not to bow, women refusing to hide their dignity, students imagining a different future, elders reminding communities who they used to be. Fear had cracked slowly, courage had seeped in quietly, and when the two met, history turned. Miss Marple now understood the psychological heartbeat of liberation. People do not rise because they are fearless. They rise because they decide fear is no longer acceptable. She closed the folder gently. The next chapter, she knew, would focus on the long-term consequences of freedom, how newly independent nations embraced change, identity, and rebuilding. But for tonight, she let the peace of understanding settle around her. The mystery of courage, like all mysteries, had revealed itself not through noise, but through noticing the smallest human truths. Chapter 9. The New Dawn. Nations Rebuilding Themselves. The following morning carried an unusual brightness into Miss Marple's sitting room. It was not just sunlight. There was a sense of renewal, as though the world itself were beginning again. She felt this mood fitting, for the next folder in the wooden box was titled, "After Independence, Rebuilding from Within." Miss Marple paused before opening it. She understood instinctively that liberation was not the end of a story, merely the beginning of a new chapter. The real challenge lay not in breaking chains, but in deciding what to do once they were gone. At last she opened the folder. Inside were carefully arranged reflections, reports, journal entries, and quiet observations from newly independent nations across Asia and Africa. They were not triumphant in tone. Instead, they were gentle, contemplative, aware of the fragile beauty and immense responsibility of starting anew. A note at the top read, Freedom gives wings, but nations must learn again how to fly. Miss Marple settled more deeply into her chair. This, she knew, was the heart of her investigation, the moment when history turns its gaze toward the future. The first set of documents described India in the years following independence. One might expect celebration, but the tone of the notes was thoughtful, almost tender. A writer observed, "We rejoiced, but quietly, for we knew freedom carried responsibility, and responsibility demanded unity. India had inherited vast challenges, deep poverty, social differences, the scars of partition, and the weight of centuries of colonial governance. Yet the documents Miss Marple read did not focus on difficulty alone. They emphasized the extraordinary patience of a people learning to govern themselves. One account described how villagers gathered to discuss local issues freely for the first time. Even a simple debate over water access felt revolutionary because it belonged to them, their voices, their decisions, their future. Another reflection noted, democracy was not a gift. It was a habit we had to build slowly, breath by breath. Miss Marple found this deeply meaningful. She had always believed that true change grows through many small conversations, not sudden proclamations. There was also a touching passage from a young Indian bureaucrat. We had no experience, but we had hope, and hope was enough to begin. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She admired this humility. Independence did not transform societies overnight. It simply opened the door. People still had to walk through. The next series of notes focused on African nations that had reclaimed their sovereignty. Miss Marple sensed immediately that these transitions carried unique complexities. A Ghanaian observer wrote, "We celebrated beneath the same sky that once watched over our silence, but now we spoke, and our voices startled even us." In many African nations, borders had been carelessly drawn by colonial powers, cutting across tribes, cultures, and ancient communities. Independence meant more than creating governments. It meant healing wounds and reimagining belonging. Miss Marple read about village councils returning, elders regaining respect, and local languages rising again in schools. She found this line particularly moving. We did not build a nation. We rediscovered one. Kenya's notes reflected both excitement and caution. Freedom arrived, but so did the question, how do we carry so many different dreams within one homeland? Miss Marple understood this dilemma well. She had seen families in St. Mary Mead where different personalities, opinions, and habits all had to coexist. Nations, she realized, were similar just on a grander scale. One African teacher wrote, "We walked forward with stitched-together histories, hoping the seams would hold." Miss Marple admired the quiet strength in that sentence. Rebuilding was not simple. It was patient work like repairing a quilt that had been torn for generations. The Indonesian documents revealed a nation determined to reconnect with its inner identity. A poet wrote, "We were free, but freedom is not a flag. It is the right to breathe in our own language again." Indonesia had long been shaped by foreign powers in trade, culture, and policy. After independence, one of its greatest tasks was simply remembering itself. There were accounts of teachers rewriting textbooks to include local folklore and heroes. Musicians revived old songs that had been overshadowed by imported tastes. Artisans practiced craft whose meaning had been almost forgotten. Another observation read, We rebuilt our nation not through concrete and roads, but through memory. Miss Marple appreciated this deeply. In her own investigations, remembering was often the first step toward solving any mystery. Likewise, Indonesia's reconstruction began in its cultural soul. Economically, the notes described the struggle of managing natural resources for the people, rather than for distant corporations. It was a delicate balance hope mixed with uncertainty. A final line from a village elder stayed with her. Freedom did not make everything easy, but it made everything ours. Miss Marple found that beautiful. Ownership not just of land, but of identity, was the essence of rebuilding. As Miss Marple placed the last document back into the folder, the room had filled with the golden light of late afternoon. She felt deeply moved. The story of independence was not just about liberation, it was about learning to live again. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Freedom is not a moment. It is a long, unfolding conversation between past and future." She continued, "Nations rebuild the way people heal, slowly, imperfectly, bravely." She reflected on everything she had read. India piecing together unity from breathtaking diversity. African nations reclaiming dignity and identity. Indonesia rediscovering its cultural heart. Communities everywhere learning to govern themselves with trembling but hopeful hands. She wrote one final conclusion. Independence ends empire but begins responsibility. This, she realized, was the true continuation of the mystery she had been tracing across continents. Each nation had faced shadows of the past even as they walked toward the sunlight of future possibility. The next chapter, she knew, would explore how these movements reshaped global consciousness, how the world itself changed when Asia and Africa reclaimed their place. Miss Marple rose slowly, stretching her hands. The evening was gentle, and so was her heart. She had followed clues from whispers to winds, from fears to freedoms, and now she understood the quiet truth behind rebuilding. A nation is strongest not when it stands alone, but when its people stand together. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Final Reflection. The Legacy of Freedom. The sun was beginning its gentle descent over St. Mary Mead, casting long golden beams across Miss Marple's sitting room. The wooden box, now familiar, almost companion-like, rested on her table, its papers neatly arranged after days of careful study. Miss Marple knew that today she would open the final folder, not simply because it was the last one, but because her heart felt ready for the completion of this long journey across time, continents, and the inner landscapes of human courage. She removed the final bundle from the box. Its title was simple, understated. Legacy, the World Transformed. Miss Marple ran her finger lightly over the letters. She sensed that this chapter was not just an ending. It was also a summation of everything she had learned, an elegant resolution to the mystery that had unfolded page by page. She opened the folder, feeling as though she were stepping into a quiet chamber where history whispered its final truths. Inside the folder was a map unlike the ones she had studied before. It did not show colonies or borders or river lines. Instead, it displayed colors vast, sweeping shades across continents. Asia and Africa were awash in vibrant hues, representing dozens of countries that had stepped into their own sovereignty during the 20th century. The caption beneath the map read, "The age of empires ended not with treaties, but with awakening. Miss Marple reflected on that. Empires had lasted centuries, some built on trade, others on conquest. Yet in the span of a few decades, an entire world had shifted. The map before her was living proof of the power of human resilience. Another note explained, when Asia and Africa reclaimed themselves, they reshaped more than their borders. They reshaped the world's understanding of dignity. Miss Marple inhaled softly. She had seen how dignity had served as the emotional root of every movement she studied. Without it, no struggle would have begun. With it, no empire could endure. She imagined leaders signing declarations, children raising new flags, elders speaking stories in newly valued languages. Each moment was a brush stroke on the map of human progress. The world had not merely changed. It had rediscovered balance. The next pages described how the independence movements of Asia and Africa had rippled outward, influencing people far beyond their borders. A scholar wrote, "When one nation stands, another learns to walk." Miss Marple smiled gently. That was precisely how truth worked. It always spread, in quiet but persistent ways. She read accounts of indigenous communities in the Americas who found inspiration in African liberation. Activists in the Caribbean drew strength from India's nonviolence. Even Europe, long accustomed to ruling others, began examining its own assumptions. One observer noted, "The world could no longer pretend that strength meant domination. Strength became the ability to uplift." Miss Marple saw the beauty in that. She had lived through times when people believed power was something one imposed. Now, nations were beginning to understand that true power came from equality. Another document described how newly independent countries formed alliances, shared ideas, and advocated for fairness in global forums. They had become voices in a world that previously had not heard them. Miss Marple underlined a final statement in this section. Freedom is contagious. Once one people reclaims it, others remember they deserve it too. She closed her eyes for a moment, sensing the vastness of those ripples, how a whisper in one land had become wind across the world. The fourth part of the folder held what Miss Marple cherished most, reflections not on politics, but on people. A small handwritten note read, "Independence was never only about nations. It was about humans relearning confidence." Another page contained testimonies from individuals who had lived through the transitions. A Kenyan grandmother who said, "We stood straighter, even the way we walked changed." A Burmese teacher, "We spoke in our language again. The words felt like sunlight returning after years of rain." An Indian farmer, "My father bowed his head. I raised mine." An Egyptian poet, "Freedom taught us to breathe without asking permission." Miss Marple felt warmth fill her chest. These were not political statements. They were emotional victories. The independence movements had reshaped entire identities. One line struck her deeply. Freedom restored the mirror in which nations saw themselves. She understood that metaphor. When a person sees their true reflection, unshadowed by fear or oppression, they grow into their rightful self. Nations, too, require such mirrors. The documents went on to describe how children in newly independent countries began learning histories that celebrated their ancestors instead of foreign conquerors, how traditional clothing, music, and foods regained honor, how families felt pride in speaking their own languages at home. Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, independence renews not just land but spirit. She felt a quiet gratitude for having been allowed to witness these stories through the decades-old documents in her hands. As Miss Marple closed the folder, she felt an unmistakable sense of completion, gentle, peaceful, and profound. The wooden box, once mysterious and overwhelming, now felt like a familiar friend that had guided her through one of the most meaningful investigations of her life. She opened her notebook one last time and wrote carefully. The true mystery of independence was never how nations broke chains, but how ordinary people found the courage to lift keys. Then she added, "Freedom was not granted. It was grown from memories, from unity, from dignity." She reflected on everything she had learned: India's quiet discipline, Africa's deep-rooted awakening, Indonesia's cultural reclamation, the global impact of world wars, the unity movements that crossed oceans, the courage of ordinary people, the emotional rebuilding of nations, the world's new understanding of equality. She wrote her final line, "The legacy of freedom is not in flags or borders, but in the hearts of people who understand their worth." Miss Marple closed her notebook softly. Outside, the sky had shifted into a gentle lavender shade, as if the world itself were closing a chapter. She placed the documents back into the wooden box, not as clues anymore, but as treasures. The mystery was solved, but its truth would live on, quietly reshaping how she saw human nature from her little village to the wide, awakening world. And in that moment, Miss Marple felt a calm certainty. The greatest mysteries are those answered not with facts, but with understanding.